Father, would you help out an old, altered boy? You know that the good book says that if a man gaineth the world, but lose his soul, what profit he? And that he that loses his life shall save it. Or perhaps these are just simply things of which fairy tales are made. But do you believe in miracles, laddie? Well, some may recall, during a contentious presidential election, how one practically invincible legislator in Virginia, Don Beyer, had apparently even managed to survive a close encounter with a dreaded novel coronavirus that some have suggested had been even bigger than God, having emerged clear of any infection at all after placing himself in quarantine in March 2020. And to date, over 7 million worldwide have not survived that encounter. Over 1.1 million Americans, all in half the time that it took Hitler and the Holocaust. However, while most of an empirical inclination reject out of hand the suggestion, there may remain some incurable romantics who believe in destined lovers star-crossed. There may remain even the absence of any forensic evidence, but a vast number of seemingly educated persons who believe in intelligent life forms in the cosmos. And there remain those gripped by the fascination of the paranormal, who believe in magical powers, fairies, demonic and angelic spirits, poltergeists, ghosts, goblins, Sasquatch, and even the Jersey Devil. And at least a report, it is a free country, wherein there are also those, often distinct, who profess a belief in religious things, which had been adversely impacted during the recent global public health crisis, finding as many as 1 in 5 churches closed permanently by August of 2020. The public health crisis that many have described simply as the pandemic. However, regardless of whether, for whatever reason you say, you can see the invisible, feel the intangible, or expect the impossible, at least in science, the appearance of that which we may describe as the miraculous, even in stage illusion, performed by the most able prestidigitators, rarely surpasses the intellectual rigor imposed by the scientific method and logic reasonment, the hallmarks of which have been what is referred to as replicability and reproducibility, at least by the proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected peer-reviewed sources in America, an authoritative source of high-impact original research that broadly spans the biological, physical, and social sciences. And if you have not read it in 3 years in the pandemic, you really ain't a scientist. For those not familiar with the scientific method, perhaps some review of these very basic terms may be of assistance, having failed in evolutionary pressure for 3 years of a lethal pandemic to have formless fault on yourself. Consider the character portrayed by Charlton Heston in the Cecil B. DeMille classic film, in which he had raised a wooden staff and had caused the Red Sea to part its waters, which some have described as a miracle. Movie magic notwithstanding. But by what standard might you test this proposition empirically as a scientist? If acting as a scientist, you had traveled all the way to the Red Sea, equipped with a large wooden staff, hopefully of the right variety, and had attempted to recreate this scene in real life, calling yourself maybe even Moses, performing this miracle. What problems might you still wish to consider? Well, first, Historically, most biblical scholars have established that the event did not take place at the Red Sea. That was just in the movie. But rather at the Sea of Reeds. So you would have to go to the right place. Perhaps be there at the right time. Maybe even in the right uniform. But not to be AWOL. And so your attempt to reproduce the results, or reproducibility, might fail because you had failed to replicate the methods that had been used, or replicability. Basic science. And this basic methodology and rigor is applied to all scientific experiments, regardless of what you may do on your own, at least in the scientific method, to ensure a successful record for science and history. And at least the majority of voters in 2020 had said that they followed the science. And so, certainly, this should all be reviewed. According to former Harvard professor of the philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn, who had coined the term paradigmatic shifts, with which many may be familiar in the scientific revolutions, the business of resolving anomalies is the essential business of science. So if you are not out resolving anomalies every day, then you simply are not a scientist, with the goal of developing a unified theory or a clear statement of an inviolable rule or immutable scientific law. And some may have noticed that even with an evolving science that has survived a 3-year pandemic that finds many quite upset, the longest respiratory tract infection pandemic in known history, an anomaly of itself, never questioned and yet examined. Even scientists have been baffled, befuddled by the first reported case. Intelligence community is divided. The elusive proximal origins and zoonotic source, and even the infectious dose or the amount of pathogen is required to be transmitted to bring about an infection remains unknown. And, at least officially, the emergency is over. And so, it is unlikely that the show be finding any galvanized support to discover these answers for mysteries. However, one method often used in science is to examine case studies. And where there are a series of case studies, you may have seen this, compilations, metadata analysis, one may be able to examine them for comparisons, to identify anomalies to be resolved, or to distill some defining rule, some unified theory to explain the whole. And note I said whole, that would be whole, not whole. And here, the infection of not afraid to burn in hell, John Beyer, may be of some usefulness were we to compare his infection from COVID-19 with a few other persons of similar age, similarly situated, no disparate outcomes, who had also had encounters with this dreaded coronavirus, to which the 70-year-old septuagenarian legislator was apparently invincible, like Superman, by all reports, surviving an encounter from which not even Senator Tim Kaine or the esteemed Dr. Anthony Fauci had escaped without a scratch. And this virus isn't stupid and has fooled us before. In a scientific method, researchers will attempt to identify what are called variables to study, some of which are described as dependent variables, which, as the term suggests, are of a conditional nature and depend upon some other factor, while these are placed in juxtaposition or contrast to independent variables, which are exactly as they sound, standalone factors upon consideration that depend on no other variables in the study. Independent. For quality control purposes, the scientific researchers may also add what is called a control group, or a sample that is selected to examine without manipulation to see if the results achieved in the control group, no manipulation, might differ from the samples in the experimented group, those who volunteer to participate in the perhaps phase 3 clinical trial. And so, guinea pigs. And so, from what is now known regarding the novel coronavirus, and had very early been known, especially after a robust examination in China that had been completed as early as February 2020. Most would agree that those over the age of 65 tend to experience adverse outcomes than those in younger age cohorts. There has been some disagreement, especially by the mayor of Alexandria, who insists that young people are the most at risk during COVID-19 pandemic. This is not what most have read in the New York Times, but perhaps the mayor of Alexandria does not read the New York Times. Say graduate of 90% selective Virginia Commonwealth University. Is this therefore a dependent or independent variable in a case study comparison for Don Beyer? Ask yourself whether this factor of age will change upon introduction of other elements. Dependent, independent. It is also established that persons with certain identified comorbidities, things that will make you die, tend to experience hospitalization and death after infection with SARS-CoV-2. And after the WHO had dispatched 1,800 teams of at least 5 epidemiologists to China to examine 55,924 laboratory-confirmed cases, 19 times more than had been reported in the entire United States by mid-March. That had been reported there by February 20th, 2020. They had found that approximately 80% had experienced nothing worse than mild pneumonia. You need to get vaccinated because you bear getting at most mild pneumonia. Some believe that they had to do so. While they also observed that mortality increases with age, with the highest mortality among people over 80 years of age, finding a case fatality rate, infected and dead, or CFR of 21.9%, which is rather high. And not afraid that bird in hell Don Beyer is certainly well below that risk threshold. However, they had also found that the CFR is higher among males, and at least a report Don Beyer is a male, compared to females, 4.7% versus 2.8%, and that patients who reported being retirees had the highest CFR at 8.9%. So, if you were retired and got COVID-19, your outcomes would be actually about as high as gay men in America, 9% higher than people living in the Sudan. And as a busy legislator representing progressive voters in Northam, Virginia, especially pitted in what he had described as the election of a lifetime, not afraid to burn in hell Don Beyer certainly has not yet retired and may have at least 20 more years to serve, he says. I believe he is now trying to pursue, over the age of 70, a master's degree in artificial intelligence, which would well suit a Phi Beta Kappa graduate from the prestigious Williams College, the most competitive private colleges in America. But for those less fit and less active, the WHO investigators had reported for the patients more advanced in years that patients who reported no comorbid conditions had a CFR of only 1.4%. Still a risk, indicating that it was possible in the rarest instances for a person who had been just elderly with no health condition to succumb to COVID-19, while patients with comorbid conditions had much higher rates, 13.2%. For those with cardiovascular disease, 9.2% for diabetes, 8.4% for hypertension, 8.0% for chronic respiratory disease, and 7.6% for cancer. So, our first subject, we have not afraid to burn in hell Don Beyer, who after surviving his encounter with the novel coronavirus and winning re-election for a third term, after having shown signs of frustration whenever government used God to promote bad policy ideas, or twisted the Bible to make a bad point, at the urging of Congressman Jared Hoffman and Jamie Raskin, announced his decision to join the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, described as the Atheist Club in Congress, and later announced his great pride in his 4 children who had rejected God, church, and religion. At the time of his infection, and before coming out fully against God, church, and religion, he had been 70 years of age. And in this study, it is wholly conceivable that his rejection of God had saved his life. Imagine that. Second, we have a fellow resident of Alexandria, another man named Don, who had been a clergyman, a Southern Baptist fundamentalist, and the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of Alexandria, and a Reverend Don Davidson, who had been compliant fully and had agreed to cancel in-person worship at his church even before the governor had issued any order, was 67 years old when he had been infected by the same variant of the novel coronavirus that, not afraid to burden nail Don Beyer, had escaped without any harm and without any prayer. And according to Reverend Davidson's account, he believes he had been infected while undergoing a catheterization at a hospital because he began to develop a cough and feel ill after a few days by coincidental correlation, which does not necessarily mean causation. And Reverend Davidson is definitely neither a doctor nor a scientist, having decided to preach at the age of 14, and probably does not even know that in the United States nosocomial settings, outbreaks in hospital settings were practically non-existent. Happened elsewhere in the world, but not in the United States. An anomaly. And no hospital infections in Northam Virginia had been even reported at the time of his infection. So it is not likely, unless they're keeping it quiet, that they actually had an outbreak and didn't want anybody to know. But that is his story, and we have to trust the good Reverend on his word as a man of cloth. However, clinically, cardiovascular disease, according to WHO, would have given him quite a high risk of having a rather fatal outcome, as high as 13%, 13.2% in fact, which would not be good for a increased risk of morbidity over and above his age-related risk factor at the age of 67. And yet Pastor Don, as he was often called, who had compliantly closed his church, is still alive, having declared himself non-essential in the pandemic, and decided to retire from the ministry entirely in December 2021. And so it appears, at least in coincidental correlation, from this observational study, that the further a person had moved from God in the pandemic, the chances of survival had increased. What of those atheists who turned to prayer at the beginning? We do not have any figures on them as of yet. And this brings us to the last subject, Bishop Gerald Glenn, who was 66 years old and who had no comorbidities, like not afraid to burn in Hell Don Beyer. And yet, according to the Washington Post reporter Michelle Borsey, after the first Easter in pandemic declaration, a prominent Richmond area evangelical pastor died on the eve of Easter after contracting the novel coronavirus. Bishop Gerald Glenn, 66, founder and leader since 1995 of the New Deliverance Evangelistic Church in Chesterfield, was the very first black chaplain of that community's police department and was police officer before becoming a pastor, the Richmond Times-Dispatch reported. He was a friend and a pillar of the region's faith community. U.S. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, tweeted Sunday, "My heart sinks as I learned this morning that Bishop Gerald Glenn, pastor of the New Deliverance Evangelistic Church, died yesterday from COVID-19. Kaine said, "May all do as much for so many." What? Die? Glenn preached in church and about the virus in March before he became sick, encouraging people not to be afraid. On March 22nd, 5 days after Virginia Governor Ralph Northam D. had urged people to avoid non-essential gatherings of more than 10 people, Glenn told his congregation that I firmly believe that God is larger than this dreaded virus, according to a video played April 6th by Richmond station WTBR. At least according to the tentative findings from this observational study, one might conclude that the further you moved from God, the better your outcomes in COVID-19 were. And since the bishop who had said his God was bigger than the dreaded coronavirus is dead, buried, and forgotten, the data apparently speak for themselves. However, is there something more to be considered in this study besides 3 men who happened to get COVID-19 around the same age? Was color the factor that killed Bishop Glenn? Or was it something else? Is determination of the secondary attack rate important? In China, at least according to this robust study, about 40 pages, Bruce Airwood had concluded that it is not clear that this correlates with the presence of infectious virus. He had found a secondary attack rate of less than 5%, or about your chances of getting into Harvard University. Or you might look at that in another way. 90% of persons who attempt to attend Virginia Commonwealth University, a Commonwealth partner in the pandemic that had assisted black churches, is a 90% selective college. And so 10% of those who cannot get in, divided by 2, would be the chances that the virus that either escaped from a lab or had genetically evolved in China had become our pandemic. Attention. Do I have your attention? Interest. I know that you're interested. Decision. Had you made in pandemic your decision for Christ? Action. That is up to you and your free will. Still, it is the most remarkable thing that I have ever seen. Impossible. So, were video replays like the ones you're watching now, only a few years ago. Perhaps one day, science will finally discover the elusive origins of this novel coronavirus within quite singular etiology, according to one former MI6 director. And oh, what an advance with science that will be. But what a loss that will be for storytelling. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.